Welcome to Furthering Christendom. I'm your host, Tyler McNabb, and I'm here with a special guest, Joshua Brown. He's wrote a really interesting new volume that's come out last November on Chinese thought and St. Thomas Aquinas and kind of they're pairing their thoughts together. So, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks to be here. Well, thanks for having me here. Thanks.
Right. So I wanted to, reading your book and really enjoyed it and highly recommend it for anyone who's watching, listening, and wants to maybe get into it. Even the first chapter, honestly, was like worth the price of admission alone. Um,
Oh,
so
thank you.
yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. So as I in fact just told you before we started this, um, I lived a few years in China and Macau and going back and forth through Hong Kong and Zhuhai. And yeah, sometimes whenever I would be around philosophers of a certain stripe, I would get told, like, oh, no, 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 no. The Chinese, they don't believe in God, you see. We've never have, right? There's never been sort of when our at least in our intellectual history, right? There's no room for God. So anyway, just kind of get your thoughts. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, so on the one hand, I think some of those debates are kind of insoluble because it's very hard to prove those kind of positives or negatives, right? So what I would say is, on the one hand, the people who typically argue that, whether they be, you know, Chinese or Westerners, they tend to do so for certain reasons. And for Chinese, a lot of it's because of participation under the secular state of the communist regime. And to be fair, also the what Vera Schwartz called the Chinese Enlightenment that occurs leading up to the May 4th Revolution, not May 4th Revolution, May 4th Movement, right, and the falling of the Qing Dynasty. Um, and for Western scholars, of course, there's the heritage of our own Enlightenment story, and the various kinds of rejections of God and church that go hand in hand with that. And actually, those are also stories that tie together. Um, so I think it's a very modern uh, intellectual position to say that there's no God in Chinese philosophy. Um, and you look at it in the actual historical text and things, I think it's actually very difficult uh, to make that stick if you're reading the text very charitably and seriously. So you look back in the Shang Dynasty, there's clear records of appeals to ghosts and spirits for help to figure out what to do and how to live, right? Clearly, there's funerary practices of burying people with concern for what happens after they die. Not necessarily things like hell, right? But the idea of a malignant spirits, right? Even the classical ideas of ancestral sacrifice, the idea that the spirits of the ancestors linger beyond and are able to have some kind of effect. Um, you have people like Mozi in the third, fourth century, um, who clearly talk. He says explicitly that if we don't believe in ghosts and spirits, we can't have good morality because we have to believe that they can punish us for when we are evil, right? And then, as I pointed to in the book that you're mentioning, you have concepts like uh, Tian or heaven, which you know are often touted as naturalistic kind of forces, but also function in very, or I would call robustly theistic ways of things like divine providence, right? So put it this way: if you are inclined to think that there's possibility for God to exist in Chinese thought, I think there's tremendous amounts of evidence, right? Um, the key to the problem why it becomes insoluble though is what exactly do we mean by God, right? And if we're asking whether or not there is a conception of God like we find in the Christian tradition that is going to be found in China, that of course is going to become a sticking point. And there's lots of evidence for and a lot of evidence against that proposition, I think, right? Um, so the way I tend to solve this is say that um, in certain respects, depending on how you want to push the definition of things like transcendence and God, right? There wouldn't be a sufficient definition of God in early China. In other ways, there would be, right? as a Catholic theologian, I like to be charitable and think that, there can be inaccurate, improper conceptions of God that still nonetheless are truly about God, right? I think they can be found in China, right? So, and it was worth noting that certainly when Catholicism was brought to China by folks like Matteo Ricci behind you, there were several classically trained Confucian scholars who understood and believed deeply that what the message of the Jesuits, message the Jesuits preached was a continuation of classical Confucian principles, especially regarding God and morality. And there was debate about that, sure, but some thought it was, right. So there at least is a tradition of Chinese thinkers who think that God is part of the Chinese tradition, and there are some that don't. Okay, so it's a dispute. There you go.
I don't know if you're familiar with Kelly James Clark's work. He's got a co-authored book recently that came out. And in it, basically, he makes a couple moves. He says, hey, look, he appeals to cognitive science of religion, which the paradigm view is that religious belief is an evolutionary spandrel. And then, and so, there's, for example, a book on religious cognition in China, which kind of shows that it's human propensity to believe in the supernatural or teleology, for example, is not just a Western phenomena, right? And then, he appeals to, as you mentioned earlier, the Shang Dynasty has, various instances where, we have stuff from the dynasty that where they're using Shang and Shangdi and Tian, interchangeably.
Yes.
And so then he's just like, okay, well, when you look at Confucius and he's using Tian, he's using heaven. And he's like, heaven seems to be the source of virtue. Heaven seems to be like some sort of guiding force, some sort of force that can judge. Then it's like, well, put all together and you have like a plausible story that, Tian was something more than some sort of, like Ivanhoe, who thinks it's just like an impersonal force or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I was curious to get your thoughts on that kind of take.
Well, I mean, so I think on the one hand, this speaks to how do you put this? I'm not familiar with Clark's thesis per se, and I wouldn't necessarily try to approach it through the religiosity of human being kind of argument. Although, if you did that, like for example, there's plenty of evidence that Chinese peoples sacrificed, to deities, right? And like, there's actually the emperor's name in classical China, Tianzi, right, means son of heaven, and it was actually a ritual title because only he could make the sacrifices to Tian, right? And clearly that also mixes like ancestral sacrifice and conceptions with like theistic things. But you have these very strict kind of ritual rules and things. I mean, it looks like a religious cultus, right? And I see no real. I mean, a lot of historians of Chinese thought have no problem saying there were, religion in China, right? It's really more like the philosophers of the Anglo-American school and analytical philosophy are like, no. And I think that's mainly because people like Roger Ames, right, they have a deep stake in helping to make room for this a kind of morality that's empty of any theistic, backdrop, right?
Tian is just the world, basically.
Yeah. And so I would say it would be fair to say that there's aspects of Tian that can function within that kind of system, but we need not like assume that has to be the case for everyone, right? And so maybe we'll go think about it this way. In a previous book, a friend of mine and I it called the book was Transcendence and Non-Naturalism in Early Chinese Thought.
Okay.
Something like that. It's a mouthful, right? But we kind of argue that, I mean, look, the problem with most of the arguments that people want to say that there is no God, there is no transcendence in China. And I'm like, well, I mean, but there seems to look like transcendence. So wouldn't it be better just to say that you have Chinese thinkers who have various conclusions about whether there is or is not God, right? And take it on its face, right? So you could say someone like Xunzi, for example, another, you know, late contemporary of Mengzi, not during his time, but just after, right? He seems to be a rather, at most, deistic, right? Maybe an atheistic kind of thinker. Mengzi, I think it's very hard to read Mengzi and not come away with the idea that there's something like God going on in Mengzi, even if it's a kind of more implicit and less developed kind of way. Right. So I think there's actually, instead of having to categorize all Chinese thought as either transcendentalist or non, or deistic or non, it's like, well, you have a spectrum of people, and we need not put them in prearranged categories to satisfy our own kind of projects, right?
Right.
So that's one thing I would say. Another thing I would say is, I think a lot of people who do this kind of work, they also they don't really take into account the preconceptions they have about like what transcendence mean or what God means. Right?
Interesting.
Like for example, in that previous book I mentioned, I make the argument with my co-author that a lot of the people like Roger Ames, when they say there's no transcendence in early China, what they really mean is they have a what Catherine Tanner called a contrastive model of transcendence in mind, right? And I would say, by that standard, Christian theology also rejects the transcendence of God if it's a contrastive model, right? But we think about like Aquinas, for example, where God's transcendence means that God is the perfect cause of all goodness, right, in which all things participate. That's not contrastive. It's actually this very complementary style of transcendence, right? And you can have a different kinds of transcendence show up, right? And so it seems to me, ironically, I think the people who are rejecting things like transcendence, they actually have a very kind of 17th, 18th century conception of either God or transcendence that they are then using as this measuring stick for whether or not this concept is present in early China.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I was going to get into a question I was going to ask. So I'm working on a Cambridge Elements right now in Eastern philosophy and classical theism. And in it, I make the point that maybe individuals like Ivanhoe, who kind of see something more impersonal, but he's not as reductivistic as Ames. That kind of a good dose of classical theism might be able to kind of understand, make sense of the intuitions of the impersonal and the kind of like the other. And so perhaps some of the sinologists and stuff that are kind of saying, no, there is no God in Chinese thought, have in mind a kind of more anthropomorphic, or as an analytic philosophy, we call it kind of a neo-classical theist or a theistic personalist kind of view of God, where God is just like very much a person like you and I, and has properties and, acts and engages in the world just like you and I act and engage in the world. And maybe that's going to not be consistent with some of the ways in how Tian is presented, but that's not what we mean by theism. So I don't know. Does that seem right to you?
No, it does seem right. Now, granted, what I would, in some cases, is just I think that like Ivanhoe himself will mention, for example, that he's just not really that deeply aware of like the theological tradition. In Hall and Ames, they had this book called Anticipating China, where they try to talk about things like Christian doctrine of the Trinity. And it's clearly they wouldn't pass a basic systematic theology exam, right? So I think a lot of these folks, they have avoided understanding of the Catholic and Christian tradition about theology and like how we talk about God in the first place. And so it's more like there's this kind of this uncritically examined assumptions about what the notion of God is, right? And I think a lot of those are actually given to them through a kind of Enlightenment deistic language structure about who God is. So I think that's part of it, right? Or more broadly speaking, a kind of Protestant liberalism, right? That kind of has been filtered down, and that it just kind of shapes the assumptions that are based on which they themselves reject or accept or reject, right, the notion of God, and that they use that to kind of plug in for everything else, right? So there's like an intellectual culture problem that we have, right? of like, so there's a history to be written, I suppose, of American secularism, and it's the really, you know, um, parochial and perhaps even poor theology it's based on. So there's that, right? But I think also things like, um, the impersonal God questions here from Ivanhoe. I mean, I think about this, something like Aquinas would help us with this, right?
Uh-huh.
That Aristotle's unmoved mover is not exactly a personal God, right?
Uh-huh.
It's not as though Aristotle really seems to advance towards a doctrine of the Trinity, or like the
Right.
idea of God loving the world, right? Um, and so, Aristotle, I would say that's a kind of impersonal conception of God, right? That is nonetheless useful, fruitful, and in certain respects resonant with the Christian notion of God, even if it is deficient in other respects, right? So, like, yeah, you can't get from unmoved mover to John 3:16, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think as a theologian, you realize that this kind of philosophical theology, um, there are all kind of ways in which, especially pre-Christian philosophers, uh, talk about the divine and or things of God, and um, you know they can articulate things that the Christian tradition, after in light of revelation, can accept and promote and think it's great, and there are things that we have to be critical about, right? Um, and it's not like there's a list of things that they have to have. So like it's not that every pre-Christian philosopher knew that God was personal or something,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, so yeah, in that respect, I think there's also a kind of, how would you put it? I mean, weirdly, it's like someone like Aquinas seems to be much more charitable with people like Aristotle and the
Right.
Neoplatonists about taking them seriously, as that they're really talking about God. He thinks they're wrong, but they're part of a conversation. And the secular folks are like, we put you in a position to say that, well, we can't really take them seriously thinking about God because theirs looks very different from our conception of God. So they're not even having the same conversation.
Mm.
And I think that's a very uncharitable thing to do as a theologian, at least, right?
Mm.
Um, so I suppose, like, for audience, right, you would say that we have to bear in mind, as a theologian, I'm concerned with one's approach to these things, and I'm not particularly worried about what Roger Ames thinks about me, right? But if I was like talking to like philosophers
Yeah.
who want to approach this, it would maybe have different tact, right? But as a theologian, I don't think it's fair or charitable to dismiss
Hmm.
the possibility for having a dialogue about who and what God is,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it doesn't look exactly the same.
Yeah. 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 And to give you kind of a little bit of background where I'm coming from, um, I very much, I'm not sure if you're familiar with kind of the more grammatical Thomist or Blackfriar Thomist tradition, where it's like
Hmm.
God's on a thing, right?
Yeah,
And so,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think that's just that can sit quite well. Um, let's talk about your book 'cause it's really good and really interesting. Chapter one, what's it about? What do you argue there?
Okay, yeah. So for those who the three who have read it can sit on this. No, I'm kidding. Excuse me. No, so the entire book is structured on conversations. The idea is that if Aquinas had read early Chinese philosophy, what would he have done with it? Visa, like similar to what he did with Aristotle, right? And for those who don't know, Aristotle was not baptized by Aquinas. Aquinas rejects very many things he finds in Aristotle, but he thinks Aristotle is a wonderful way to help begin thinking carefully and seriously about God, and had many good, true things to say, right? So that's a starting point. So what if Aquinas could go back and would have known Chinese and could read these texts well,
Mhm.
right? That's the thought experiment. And so each chapter of the book kind of does that in a different way. And the first chapter of the book, which we're going to talk about, is based on if Aquinas had read the Mengzi. And I don't know how your audience is familiar with not, but the Mengzi is basically the second most important text of classical Confucianism. He's been compared to the Plato. I think that's a decent comparison, Plato of Confucianism, where Confucius is like Socrates, right? And so the idea of reading the Mengzi, and specifically in this case, about whether or not, or to what degree, um, Mengzi's notion of Tian or heaven accords with the Christian Catholic notion of God. And so the idea is that if Aquinas sat down and read Mengzi on Tian, what would he have seen that kind of resonates with the Catholic notion of God? And what would he have said? Oh, we probably should rethink this a little bit, right? And the last piece of context that I'll say about that is, for my purposes, it's because ultimately, I'm trying to help develop Chinese Catholic theology, where we can do Catholic theology that uses Chinese philosophy seriously as a resource for thinking about and articulating these things, and to figure out, okay, what are its strengths, what are its weaknesses vis-a-vis that kind of project, right? So that's the landscape of how I go about it. And then the chapter itself is just focused on trying to unpack Mengzi's notion of Tian or heaven, and then provide a kind of Thomistic assessment that is trying to read it and see what's going on from the view of Aquinas. That's the basic overview.
You put it, and you have like kind of if my memory serves me correctly, you have kind of three categories that you speak about Mengzi being kind of seeing Tian in. One of them is kind of the source of creation, right? Another one is kind of the source of like providence or guidance. So can you talk a little bit about, I know kind of particularly like chapter 6a and 5a, I think, are big ones for these, but could you talk a little bit more?
Yeah, certainly. So I mean, some of this is drawn from obviously both Catholic conceptions of areas of concern, and what Mengzi himself would talk about. So so the idea of Mengzi is Mengzi talking about Tian as the source of creation, the source of all things. Tian as the providential force that governs all things in a sense, and then as the source of moral order, more or less, right? And then they're kind of you could argue as a Thomist, I suppose, that B and C are basically the same, but they're different, very different themes in Mengzi, you could say. Not much different, but they're profoundly important, so they need to be treated separately. Excuse me. So we take them in turn very briefly, I suppose. So the first one is helpful to back to earlier conversation as well. In Matteo Ricci's Tianzhu Shi, which is the true meaning of Lord of Heaven, he has this fascinating, layout of Catholic natural theology, right?
Yep.
And at a point in the dialogue, his Chinese interlocutor, who Ricci writes for him, but presumably based on real conversations, right? The Chinese interlocutor says, we've heard about this idea of divine providence, of the governance of the world. Key, divine creation? What is this? We never heard of this, right? So the interlocutor points out that in Chinese tradition, there had been this assumption or familiarity with this idea of a divine governance, but that idea of divine creation was not really deeply part of the Chinese tradition, which I find it very, very fascinating and something we can go back to. So that means that for Mengzi, then, I mean, divine creation, the idea of heaven as the source of all things, is kind of very ambiguous. It's underdeveloped, right? I mean, it's kind of there. So in book 6 and 7 of the Mengzi, Mengzi does talk about Tian as this kind of giving birth to all things, right? Or at least descending, Jiang, right? And being all things. But there's nothing like a Genesis 1 or Creatio ex nihilo, right? And it's not even very clear in what sense heaven is an agent of creation, right? So there's a classical depiction. Do I still have? Oh, I have it. Let me have it over here. Let me show you.
Yeah.
Short reader. So I can.
Oh, very nice.
This is a thing called the Great Ultimate, right? Diagram of the Great Ultimate, which was proposed by Taoists but was used by a later Neo-Confucian called Zhou Dunyi, right? And it kind of held that in the beginning you had this nothing, right? That then somehow spontaneously, more or less, whatever, somehow it generates into two yin and yang chi, right? Yin and yang movements, right? Which then disperses into the five elements, right? Which then disperses into the feminine and masculine forces, right? That then lead to the 10,000 things and give birth to them, right?
Yeah.
Um, so
Which gets some
does
inspiration.
Meng's idea of what? So Mengzi doesn't have that system. But one question you could ask is, does Mengzi his conception of Tian, is it kind of natural, kind of just life itself?
Yeah.
A name for life itself that kind of gives rise to everything? Is it just the kind of evolutionary process of spontaneous creation? Is it a divine ordering of existence? It's very ambiguous. It's not really clear, right? And in a certain respect, Mengzi could fit neatly into a lot of these different categories and boxes, right?
Right. It's kind of consistent with, but underdeveloped as to which one specifically, right?
Yeah. I mean, in part because the question about how the world came to be is not that important to Mengzi, right?
Right.
And we could talk about that for other reasons. But so from this perspective, my argument is that there's just not a lot you can say for sure about how Mengzi's conception of the Tian bringing about the world is like God, because it's like in the Christian tradition, it's very, very clear. You have to be careful that it's God who creates, not God creating through angels, right? Not God creating by accident, right? But it not God creating out of like himself, to make the world, but God speaking something besides himself into being and then giving that a sharing in his own life, so there are very specific rules about what that looks like. Talk about God well, and in that sense, Mengzi just doesn't talk enough about what creation means to be like a robust theological conception of God, right? But you have things like divine order, and for Tian, for Mengzi, I should say, Tian is like the thing that orders the cosmos, right? It's certainly history, right? So your audience may or may not know the classical idea in Chinese tradition of Tian Ming, or the mandate of heaven.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the idea that Tian has a mandate, right, that oversees the rise and fall of dynasties. Right.
That's right.
And the classical question is, what does this actually mean? And I would even say, I do say in the book, right, it's like the problem that Mengzi has, right? Because Mengzi lives in a time in which the empire is falling apart, right? It's leading to moral degradation, right? You have the usurpation of classical ritual practices of the Tao, the way, as things are supposed to be according to Confucian wisdom. And he's like looking for the next king to arise, because that's the next person that Tian has elected to be the next ruler, right? And it's just not there. In fact, the last passage of the Mengzi, it ends on Mengzi basically saying, "Where is he? Where is he? This new king?" Right? I mean, it's a really dramatically sad text if you think about it in that ways, And so essentially, I think Mengzi he comes into the book with this assumption as a Confucian that something called Tianming, or mandate of heaven, orders the world. It has proclaimed that those who do what is morally right and virtuous will actually find true flourishing, right? And that we hold to this principles and practices, we will flourish, we will have nobility, we will succeed, all those things. And turns out none of that is really happening, at least for those who, like him, are supposedly doing this thing, right? So there's a real kind of crisis in whether or not heaven is ordering things or how it's ordering things. And so that's essentially what I'm arguing goes on from Mengzi, right? Is that he's convinced there's something about Tian that orders the world, but it's in a kind of chaotic moment. So it's not clear. In some cases, he has a very strong conception of Tian ordering the world, like almost as like the ruler, like mandating things to subjects. And in some cases, it's more like Tian is kind of a natural law of natural consequences, right? That if you do good, people will think of you well, right? And my own opinion is that kind of probably reflects different points in his career when
Mm.
he had different opinions about different experiences of what Tianming
Mm.
meant. So yeah, I'll pause there. We can say that he has a very what do you say? It's a variable conception of Tian's providence, or
Yeah.
Tian as a providential force, right? It is always a providential force, but in what sense is it providential? Is it strongly theistic? Is it more kind of naturalistic force? There's kind of a spectrum you get amongst them.
Yeah. No, that's very good. That's very helpful. No, thanks for that. So, what are you working on now? Now that you finished this book, what are you doing now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so one thing, I'm writing an article for a project we're talking about together. So there's that. But no, the main project I'm working on is I've actually gone to do translations and studies of Archbishop Stanislaus Luoguang,
Hmm.
who was a bishop in Taipei for about a decade. And so I'm finishing up now with translation of his writings on Vatican II, because he was a bishop at Vatican II. And he was also an expert in Neo-Confucian philosophy and Chinese philosophy, wrote religious and philosophical texts. I think like his transcript or his collected volumes of his books in Chinese is like 43 volumes.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm working through that and uncovering basically the Chinese Catholic, Chinese Catholic reading of Chinese philosophy and things like that. Yeah.
That's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. And then his major work was called The Philosophy of Life. And so I'd like to do some work there and unpack how he kind of he mixes or embodies, you could say, he lives out of both the Confucian tradition and the Catholic tradition, and kind of study how he brings these things together to talk about things like creation and our adoption into the life of sons of God, right? In Christ. I mean, it's all fascinating stuff. So that's the primary area I'm coming in for next.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on here, telling us about your work, and it's all really helpful and really interesting.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.